Hello all, and welcome back to the channel, Global Affairs with Greg Ayers. Today, I'm going to be discussing the evolution and pursuit of cybersecurity in Brazil, a joint project developed by myself, your venerable host, and Ms. Gabriela Harquin of Florida International University. I'm going to be discussing our recent paper on cybersecurity in Brazil. In it, we detail Brazil's cyber history, the evolution of Brazil's cyber legislation, and put forth 7 precise recommendations to augment Brazil's current 2020 E-Ciber strategy. For this full report and more, visit our website at globalaffairs.gregayers.com/go. So to provide a basic overview, we're going to be discussing the flaws within Brazil's cybersecurity strategy, identifying the root causes, and making those 7 distinct policy recommendations to improve Brazil's cybersecurity. And again, these are going to be governance actions specific actions the Brazilian government can take to improve their cybersecurity strategy and cybersecurity outcomes. I begin with a short quote from the joint paper. Brazil's outsized exposure to cyber threats is a product of haphazard policy changes, flawed organizational structure, and political instability. This is going to be a core theme running through both the paper and the presentation. Moving forward, we'll provide a short background on Brazil's cyber history and then cover Brazil's current trends in cybercrime. We put forth those 7 policy recommendations derived from global and regional best practices, which address Brazil's cybersecurity obstacles and headwinds. So you're going to see those 7 policy recommendations moving forward, but we begin with the evolution of Brazil's cybersecurity. So starting with this brief evolution of Brazil's cybersecurity strategy. As it can be seen in the figure depicted on the right, Brazil's adoption of the internet in the early 1990s coincides with a massive increase in Brazil's GDP. Internet adoption continues to rise and proves a strong driver of Brazil's economic growth, even now as Brazil's economy cools. As a primary driver of the Brazilian economy, this cyberspace needs to be secured, as increased connectivity leads to increased exposure and risk. Those two work hand in hand, connectivity and risk exposure. For decades, Brazil has operated behind the technological power curve. There was a strategic delay. When Brazil's national defense policy first mentioned cyberspace in 2005, over 20% of the nation was already online. We see point number 1 here on the left, and point number 1 here on the chart. Over 20% of the country was already online by the time cybersecurity was even mentioned in a national defense policy document. It would take another 11 years for cyber strategy to find a home. By the time E-Ciber, Comando Cibernetico, based and hosted within the Brazilian Army, was created in 2016. By then, over 60% of the nation has internet access, and Brazil has already suffered multiple major cyber attacks. And we see this major gap between points 1 and 2, when cybersecurity is first mentioned and when it finally finds a strategic home in Comando Cibernetico. Presently, the 2020 E-Ciber strategy governs. When it was published in 2020, it was intended to govern for 3 years, but a lot has happened since 2020. And the world's a different place. The cyber threats are too dynamic to delay further. We're going to take a look at the current trends in cybercrime in our next slide. And with this current graphic, you might have noticed that our chart, the data provided by the United Nations World Bank, is only as current as 2019. Unfortunately, current data is unavailable. And in a way, this is reflective of Brazil's cybersecurity deficit. They can't even really quantify how large the problem is. So with the current trends, by all available metrics, cybercrime is on the rise in Brazil. Brazil is by far the most targeted nation in Latin America, and by some metrics, the 3rd most targeted globally, behind only China and the United States, countries with more wealth and a larger population. Brazil faced 733 million attacks in 2021. That's more than 3 per person annually. And the number is likely higher, as cyber attacks often go unreported or even unnoticed. If you look at the figure on the top right, you can see an overwhelming majority of these attacks originate within Brazil. That tall bar, diagram at the top right, top left bar, Brazil, that's 82.3% of all attacks. Brazil is its own worst enemy. Brazil is also plagued by a variety of attacks, from scams to fraud to denial of service, worms, amongst others. With trends demonstrated in the bottom right graphic, we can see scams, that's the red line here, remain the most popular. And perhaps worryingly, worms, orange line here, are on the rise and in many ways more costly than the other types of attacks. All this crime, it comes at a cost. Hard numbers, we're talking $100 billion a year. That's 7% of Brazil's GDP. This cost is also likely undervalued, as it can fail to capture the investments canceled, businesses not opened, or damage from loss of faith or prestige. Government services and private industry are the two largest fish or targets within Brazil. Going back 2021, Brazil's Ministry of Justice was incapacitated by cyber attack for almost 2 months by ransomware groups. Ministry of Health saw vast sums of public health and vaccine data leaked to the public. Nuclear power plants, telecommunication plants fell under attack. Scary. The attacks on nuclear power infrastructure truly highlight Brazil's risk exposure in a frightening way. Within the private sector, the banking sector is the most common target. Everything from ATM hacking to spear phishing of executives to advanced banking Trojans, most of which are generated within Brazil, are deployed and wreak havoc, not just in Brazil, but globally. And as I mentioned before, the most worrying trend, the growing sophistication of domestic origin cyber attacks. Again, notably, these worms I previously mentioned. Brazil is the birthplace of the Tetrada banking Trojan, part of the Bizarro family of banking Trojans. Brazil is home to operatives of the Lapsus group, notable for their ransomware attacks in Brazil and Europe. Brazil has also fallen victim to foreign groups from everywhere from North Korea to China. But again, these attacks, they constitute some of the larger, more costly attacks. But the most common are these smaller scale domestic origin Brazilian-centered attacks. Taking a look at our policy recommendations, we put forward, as I said, 7 policy recommendations for the Brazilian government. Each recommendation will be scored from high to low on cost, pace of change, and impact. And we'll provide more detail on that in the written report. So our 7 policy recommendations are as follows. Establish a centralized governance model. Enhance the existing legal framework, particularly the capacity for attribution and prosecutions. Increase infrastructure funding and accountability. Increase societal collaboration, such as bringing in non-governmental entities. Increasing partnerships, encouraging the development of innovative solutions, and improving maturity through sponsored cyber exercises. These policy recommendations would flow through the Brazilian federal government, currently led by Jair Bolsonaro, while former President Lula da Silva is currently polling as his most likely successor. We see those 2 most likely candidates here on the graphic on the right. So getting into the recommendations. Number 1, establish a centralized governance model. This represents a low-cost, medium pace of change, high-impact solution for Brazil. In the present system, seen in the bottom left, the lowest coordinating authority for cybersecurity is the president. That's the lowest box in which all lines meet together. Leaving aside your opinions on President Bolsonaro, this is a flawed structure. The president and executive office should not be the sole common node for the government cybersecurity actors. All of the agencies listed below, the Ministry of Defense, the Armed Services, Cyber Command, the Presidential Security Office, the police, the intelligence services, Ministry of Justice, they all play a role in ensuring Brazil's cybersecurity. And cyber resilience, the core goal of the 2020 E-Ciber strategy that currently governs, it relies upon 4 things: defense, attribution, resumption of services, and retaliation. Our recommendation, the establishment of a centralized governance model, coordinates all 4 of these tasks under a singular authority, Comando Cibernetico. To this end, we propose the organizational structure seen in the bottom right follow the arrow along. Notably, the modification of ComD-Cyber into a genuine coordinating command. You see it in blue in that bottom right graphic. This creates parity between Brazil's armed services, no longer preference of the army, and allows for a singular body to coordinate the military, intelligence, law enforcement, and technological sectors in Brazil's government without bogging down the president, those day-to-day details. So it allows Comando Cibernetico to serve as that singular coordinating authority, coordinates all aspects underneath the president. Restructuring Brazil's cyber actors. This represents a low-cost, high impact change which can be achieved in the medium term. The new Commando Cibernetico will coordinate all cybersecurity affairs below the president, offering that genuine direction from an approved strategy. Commando Cibernetico is modeled after the United States Cyber Command and offers similar benefits as an apolitical body, an important thing given Brazil's internal politics, which are incalculably chaotic. Brazil's national bank, BACEN, demonstrates the feasibility and success achievable through a stable apolitical body. Again, Commando Cibernetico creates parity amongst the services, removes Brazil's army from its historical reign atop the services, and allows for Brazil's cybersecurity strategy to be demilitarized, something that's going to be very important as demonstrated in our later slides. And it allows for equal input from law enforcement, the intelligence community, and the military. And this is our most important recommendation, and it segues us into our second recommendation. Enhancing the legal framework. Enhancing Brazil's legal infrastructure and adapting to global best practices in line with top performing Latin American nations, such as Chile and Paraguay, represents a low-cost, high-impact course of action, which can yield rapid results. Global and regional leaders utilize policing-centric models, which primarily view cybersecurity through a law enforcement lens. This shift will require moving E-Ciber out of its purely military role, as proposed in the previous slide, and to the new superior coordinating role. As I mentioned, Latin America's top-ranking nations, Chile, Paraguay, according to the NCSI cybersecurity scores, they place control of cybersecurity under national police and telecommunications agencies, respectively. This approach is mirrored in the world's highest-performing cyber nations, mostly the Baltics and Scandinavia, which avoid outright military preeminence in cybersecurity affairs. In order to serve as an effective deterrent, Brazil has to achieve an increase in cybercrime prosecutions. Difficult. Less than 1% of all arrests in Brazil are for fraud or cybercrime. Genuine deterrence will require increased attribution capabilities, a gap which is occasionally filled by foreign nations, mostly the United States and members of the European Union, in high-profile cases. But Brazil evidently needs help attributing attacks, and this can come with help from foreign nations or consultations with private firms. Again, with 733 million attacks a year, more than 3 per person annually, they need help with attribution. In the figure on the bottom right, we see those NCSI scores I was alluding to. Paraguay in the dark blue, Chile in the red, Argentina in the light blue, and Brazil finally in green. We can see that Paraguay and Chile dominate policy and policing rankings. They also have the highest overall scores in Latin America. In contrast, Brazil's perfect score in military fails to translate, as they score worst among the sampled nations. See it down here next to the country names. Brazil scores 74th, despite having 100% in the military category, whereas Paraguay and Chile, 46 and 47. Their high result is due to their scores within policy and policing. So that's why we call for the demilitarization and enhancing the legal framework, taking us into our third recommendation. Increasing infrastructure funding and accountability. This represents a high cost, high impact recommendation, which can be achieved over the long term. Upgrading and updating hardware is expensive and time consuming. This factors heavily into recommendation number 3's overall scoring. Brazil's infrastructure suffered 19,500 attacks in 2019, the last year for which we have accurate data, by far the most in Latin America. Notably, power plants from Eletrobras and Companhia Paranense de Energia were hit. Again, the Ministry of Justice and Ministry of Health websites were attacked. Data storage was compromised and ransomed. Updating and replacing hardware, like out-of-date and susceptible SCADA, supervisory control and data acquisition controllers, is a historical challenge. Outdated and unpatched SCADA controllers were at fault for a swath of attacks on power providers in 2018, a fault that remains largely unaddressed, and a fault that was known for over a decade. Segmenting infrastructure networks is another key priority, as threat and incursions might be isolated to minimize overall damages. The Brazilian government can fund these initiatives and use penalties to enforce accountability, but private industry must supply the hardware, software, and businesses such as Accenture or other private firms may be best suited to maintain and update or patch existing devices or codes, given Brazil's own demonstrated inabilities. Taking us into our fourth recommendation, increase societal collaboration. This represents a low cost, low impact set of changes, which can be achieved over the medium term. Government engagement. The support of nonprofits and industry working groups fosters buy-in from stakeholders capable of generating self-generating security. IDEC, Instituto Brasileiro de Defensa do Consumidor, is a model nonprofit in Brazil. They perform a role similar to the Consumer Protection Agency in the United States. They publish reports and inform the public of notable scams and cyber risks. Their logo's over here on the top right, and they're popular amongst the public. They increase public awareness, educate consumers, and increase whole of society defenses. But they only publish and report on about 200,000 cases annually. And remember, there's 733 million reported attacks in Brazil in 2021. So there is a capacity gap, but the government might be able to help fill in. Brazil can increase private sector collaboration by sponsoring more cybersecurity exercises and working with private sector companies to develop a host of competitive events. More to come on this later. And the banking sector. Brazil's largest banks, featured in the bottom right graphic, in a meaningful way, they could be further incorporated to create proactive regulations, which can benefit all banking users. Most Brazilians bank. Many of Brazil's banks led the charge on two-factor authentication at ATMs, but the industry should work hand in hand with the government in matters of security moving forward, and it's time for the government of Brazil to catch up. So banks have been able to lead the way in some cases, but they could use help with regulation and uniformity, as well as proactive approaches so that they can work off of their leading foot. This takes us into our fifth recommendation, Brazilian government to increase partnerships. Increasing partnerships, middling cost, middling impact recommendation that can yield results over the medium term. Brazil has global partnerships, but they could be stronger. Primary partners include the European Union, notably Portugal and Spain for linguistic and cultural reasons, the United States and some of Brazil's continental peers here in South America. The most beneficial relationships stem from the United States and the European Union, particularly in the form of SMEs, or subject matter expert exchanges, advanced technological applications, acquisitions, and attribution. Brazil benefits greatly from this attribution work performed by the US and various European Union governments, notably in the tracking of banking Trojans. The map on the top right reflects a multinational effort which tracked the spread of the Bizarro banking Trojan. As we can see, truly a global problem. Red being more instances, green being less, and white covering some of those countries for which we have no data, but truly a global problem that required global tracking and attribution. Increasing collaboration in academia is also likely required, as computer science programs underperform other departments at each of Brazil's 7 largest universities. The universities are displayed here on the bottom right, with the green bar reflecting the total number of programs and the blue bar showing the internal rankings of the universities. Computer science department. Note, none of these computer science programs crack the top half of the program offered. We're looking at the overall relationship, height of the green bar compared to the height of the blue bar. Blue bars aren't going too high up. This opens the door for increased benefit from international academic exchanges. These cybersecurity programs could use some help. Maybe we can lend them Professor Pons. This leads us into the attribution and policing aspects. Given the truly global nature of cybercrime, again, looking at our map there on the top right, international partnerships and relationships are required to track, detain, and prosecute cyber criminals. Brazil can benefit greatly from increased participation in cyber exercises like Cyber Guardian, which to date is an army-dominant exercise, but our proposal is to change that a bit. We will touch more on cyber exercises in the next 2 recommendations, which we see now. Innovation. It's harder than it sounds, and it sounds hard. It represents a medium cost, slow impact of change, high impact recommendation. Investing in innovation might pay off, but you never quite know when in real time. Encouraging innovation from a cybersecurity perspective really means being proactive. The dominant format for proactive solutions is performing exercises or competitions. Brazil can federally sponsor more competitions, such as the global Capture the Flag competition. Chart here on the right. Brazil has performed increasingly well over recent years, but does not enter as many teams as global leaders in cyber. Overall performance in blue, lower bar is getting better, number of teams in green. So we can see the blue bars are getting lower, their overall performance is improving. Green line, total number of teams, has leveled off in recent years. Private enterprise can similarly sponsor competitions like this Capture the Flag exercise, and this can be an excellent branding and recruiting tool, promoting participation and rewarding success in cyber competitions and exercises, a relatively cost-effective way to stimulate innovation. Finally, cyber exercises, proving maturity. They represent a low-cost, high-impact recommendation that can produce immediate results. Cyber Guardian is the largest cybersecurity exercise, by some estimations, the largest in Latin America. And as hinted earlier, it's dominated by the military. Within the military, dominated by the Army. As you can see in the bottom right graphic here, that's 40 for the Army and 4 for everyone else, as far as participation in Cyber Guardian. Exercises are the pinnacle of cyber maturity. They represent a proactive approach and can readily include stakeholders from across society. We can see here a photo of Brazil's second ever Cyber Guardian exercise, Cyber 2.0. And who do we have presiding? Army Lieutenant General Naves. But they need broader participation to be optimal. We can't have this Army dominant program as demonstrated by our regional and global best practices. As we've stated, cybersecurity policies centered around the military, not ideal. They need participation from across Brazilian society, and this is where private companies can play a role. The independent development of exercises generates genuine surprise and forces the government to adapt to genuinely foreign. Participation from academia and foreign allies is also recommended, as many cyber fights fail to acknowledge or respect national boundaries. Ones and zeros don't see the lines on the map. This takes us into an overview of our governance actions and how might private industry find their place. So our 7 policy recommendations: establish a centralized governance model, enhance the legal framework, increase infrastructure funding and accountability, increase societal collaboration, increase partnerships, encourage the development of innovative solutions, improve maturity through cyber-sponsored exercises. We've talked about all these, but where's the private sector fit in? As we touched on throughout, they will have to provide the hardware and software, at least until Brazil's domestic industries mature. They have technological expertise. They can provide threat detection and attribution. Again, Brazil faces truly global threats. They can offer cost savings potential. They can help provide innovative technology and solutions. They work to import global best practices. And now we can take a look at a little bit more closely how they might get involved. The private industry. So with this governance approach, how do private companies fit in? They can fill a number of roles, given their technological expertise and Brazil's demonstrated limitations. We can go more into those afterwards. Coordinating software patches and updates, those SCADA controllers we talked about, yeah, those vulnerabilities were known at least 8 years prior. Network segmentation, just a few phishing emails incapacitated the entire Ministry of Justice for 2 months. Protecting relays and ports, Brazil has a history of telecommunications failures and outages. Multi-factor authentication, zero trust standards, they need to continue to improve their banking security. It's the #1 targeted sector, and it's mostly exploited through login vulnerabilities. Brazil has demonstrated success in leading in innovation in this area, but we have to continue to drive forward. They can participate in exercises, even take the lead with tailored or off-the-shelf products. They can oversee infrastructure maintenance and software updates, where their global reach and technological expertise provide an advantage. They can support nonprofits like IDEC, which we previously mentioned, that Consumer Protection Bureau, enhancing the messaging and educational efforts of an already successful, popular program. They can provide new capabilities like private cloud storage, management of public data. And we have a case study in our paper which details this further, one that addresses the current express need in Brazil's 3-year-long attempt to address this problem. Finally, we conclude these 7 recommendations each support and enhance Brazil's current 2020 E-Ciber strategy. They can't wait for 2023 to roll on. We need updates, we need recommendations now to achieve that cybersecurity, cyber resilience, cyber maturity. Again, these 7 recommendations constitute governance actions only, as outlined in the scope of our project, and fittingly so. The Brazilian government will play a pivotal role in Brazil's future success or failure. There's a lot on the line. Cybersecurity success would have a major societal impact, catalyzing economic growth, providing a free and transparent place for political speech, delivering safe and reliable utility services, personal data security, reducing crime, increasing soft power and regional influence, and a return to faith in governance, something Brazil has lacked in recent years. In conclusion, each of these 7 recommendations supports Brazil's e-cyber strategy. They provide more clarity and reflect both realities and opportunities. The Brazilian government will play that pivotal role in Brazil's future success or failure, but it's unlikely to succeed without the help of some relevant actors and stakeholders, both society and private enterprise. All this means Brazil will need support for these government actions, buy-in from Brazilian society, collaboration with international organizations and partners, and expertise from the private sector. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time and direct you to our full article at globalaffairswithgregayers.com/go for any further questions. We thank everyone for their time. Like the channel, follow along.